What's up? I just wanted to say, so I'm MacKenzie Smith, and I'm the director of the library at UC Davis here in the greater Northern California area. But the reason I'm here today to talk to you about data governance is that I spent many years in the trenches on this topic at MIT and also with Science Commons, the Creative Commons branch that works on science and science data. So that's really what informed my interest in this topic. And this is what I kind of call the soft underbelly of big data. You know, it's really where things get kind of ugly and unclear, as Ian alluded to earlier. So I do want to take 20 minutes or so to kind of walk you through some of the issues that come up when you start to deal with data at any scale, really, but particularly with big data. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so that's the context, and the topic is data governance. Okay, and as you've already heard, there are actually multiple types of data that we call big data. There's the kind of internal usage data, clickstream data, and that kind of thing that Ian is focusing on. And then there's the large-scale scholarly research data that Jerry touched on, and this is really what we had at scale at MIT, were these kind of scholarly research data sets. And just to give you a little bit of context, at Davis, where I work now, we have the next generation of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey project, and the PI for that informed me that they will be generating 200 to 250 terabytes a day. Thank you very much. So that problem of reducing the complexity of the data to something you can analyze is very real. That's what keeps him up at night. And they call that reducing the dimensionality of the data. So that's where the statisticians come in and the information scientists. And so that's the kind of big data that is happening in the research community, but that's not really what I think most of us are grappling with right now. We're dealing with the other side of big data, which is aggregating lots and lots of data to create significant volume of it so that you can answer interesting questions. So an example of that might be if you do MRI scans of humans, those cost $1,000 a pop, and most researchers can only afford to do 10 or 20 at a time. But that doesn't get them statistical significance if they try to do analyses. So they need to be able to combine many, many such studies. And that's when you really start to run into these governance issues, right? And other kinds of interoperability issues. So that's what I'll cover. Another quick point is that a lot of times data is very hard to produce, very expensive, and it is not reproducible, right? If you're talking about gene sequencing or something, then yes, it is. But if you're talking about climate change surveys that have been done over many, many decades, you cannot go back in time and recapture that data. So it is really important that we tackle these issues and decide how we're going to archive, preserve, and disseminate data as well as publications, because this is, in a way, the future of research. So big data analysis demands, I think, interoperability of data sets and frictionless integration. You need to be able to pull data from all over the place and put it together into something that you can process and analyze and visualize and do good stuff with at very, very large scale. So we really need this kind of seamless interoperability that you get with things like the web today. And again, there's sort of three aspects of this interoperability that I've been working on with the community for a while. There's technical interoperability. So you have standards like RDF for this. There's social interoperability, which is just the kind of trust systems that we have, and commercial arrangements. And then there's the legal interoperability. Can I legally combine these two data sets to do something new with? And that's the one I'm going to focus on now. So what is data governance? I mean, this is a kind of a new label that we use to cover a wide range of things. It's the system of decision rights and responsibilities for who can do what with data, when, under what circumstances, et cetera. It particularly involves laws and policies associated with data, so I'll be spending a little bit of time on that. Probably boring the tears out of you, but this is important to understand, at least conceptually. And then it's the data management processes that, as a business, you need to be thinking about, such as business processes and risk management, right? I can't remember who said it this morning, but the point is you need to be able to know where the data came from, trust the data, and somebody has to be accountable if the data is messed up, disappears, is misused, and things like that. So all of that falls under this heading of data governance. I think I've already covered this, and it has been said already by both of my colleagues here that data is becoming a form of content that people need to be able to manage and consume and do things with. This is driving a lot of research now, computational research, and that's part of the reason why organizations like the NSF and now the Office of Science Technology Policy are pushing people to share data more, because they need to leverage these investments and do more science. And other kinds of things too, not just science. So just to prove that I'm not making this up, you already heard from Jerry about the NSF Data Management Plan mandate, which is part of their grant proposal guidelines. And I just wanted to point out that of the 5 categories of information they ask for, 2 of them are directly related to data governance, right? So they are interested in the technical aspects of what you're going to do, but they really want to know what you're going to, what you will allow in terms of access and reuse of the data in the future. And this is really pushing buttons on a lot of researchers because they've never really thought about this before. You know, it's their data. And just the very idea that they might have to share it is kind of freaking them out. But they're getting used to it now and starting to ask questions of me and people at the universities about, well, what can we do? What should we say about these questions that they're asking? And very importantly, I think, for this audience, one of the things in the FAQ is about international collaborations. And the question was, if I participate in an international collaboration, do I really need to worry about data management policies across all the countries involved? And the answer was, yes, you do. And this is where it gets really complicated, because in the copyright world, we have treaties, we have fairly good standardization around the world. When it comes to data, it's a free-for-all. You know, almost every country, almost every legal jurisdiction has a different strategy for data. Comes up in privacy, comes up in ownership, all kinds of things. So if you thought it was complicated for publications, just wait until you get to data. Now, you already heard from Ian that there are many dimensions of this. There's the confidentiality and privacy issues, which are very, very serious, because people, I know if you follow kind of what's happening, in Facebook, for example, I had a colleague at MIT who managed to reverse engineer Facebook data and prove that a certain student was gay, just based on his Facebook profile and friends and things like that. And you know, this was a above-board analysis to prove that you could do that, but that's the kind of stuff that you can do now, easily. So it isn't a joke that privacy and confidentiality have to be considered very carefully, particularly with health data. Patents and commercial potential. You know, a lot of people laugh at me when I talk about data laws and rights, like the astrophysicists, because who on earth would care, you know, about their data? But then you move into another discipline, and all of a sudden there's some commercial potential for data, and they care very much. So you run into this perception all the time that this is or isn't a big deal, depending on the perceived value of the data and cost. And then, of course, the laws are very unclear. So I will tell you what we think is the state of play with the laws, but of course there isn't a lot of legal precedent, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I know that there's a lot of assertions and beliefs out there, but many of them have never been tested in court. So we really just don't know a lot of times what would happen. What do scholars want with data? Well, I think you've already heard that what they really care about most is that they get credit for having produced the data and all the hard work that went into collecting it, normalizing it, processing it, and so on. Beyond that, they would like easier reuse of their own data. So believe it or not, researchers lose their own data, and they want to be able to get it back and do stuff with it. Usually it's because a graduate student actually had the nerve to graduate and left and, you know, didn't explain to the PI where the data was, and that kind of thing happens a lot. Then there's the easier integration, the MRI scenario I gave you at the beginning, where you're a researcher and you have some data, but you really need to be able to combine it with a lot more data to do something interesting. That comes up a lot. Compliance, right? So they want to be compliant with their funders' requirements, but they often don't know how. And then just guidelines. You know, they will do what we tell them to do, but they need to know that it's the right advice and that it's not going to get them into trouble. So from the scholar's perspective, those are the things they care about. And Jerry talked a little bit about publishing data, which I think the Nature example was the closest we saw today. There are others out there of actually promoting data to a first-class publication object type And that's something that the library community is very interested in, because we need there to be a record. There have to be things that are linkable and citable and so on. Just an important little footnote on that is that credit is what we want, right? That's what researchers want. Citation is how we handle that in our current ecosystem. The law and these licenses that I'm going to be describing to you talk a lot about attribution. And you need to understand that those are not the same thing, right? Attribution is something that a legal license can require. Credit and citation are just social constructs that we invented. And we think of them as being sort of real, but legally they're not really the same thing, okay? So keep that in mind. Copyright in the US does not apply to facts. I'm sure many of you have heard that before. What that means is that the vast majority of data out there does not fall under copyright, okay? So copyright just doesn't apply to it at all. It can apply to collections of facts. And this is where the law gets a little bit murky, because this hasn't been tested a lot in court. But in theory, if you have created a database, that database is copyrightable, but the data in it is not, okay? So the way you organized it and the value add that you provided is intellectual property, but the facts inside the database, not so much. So it would be legal to extract data from a database and do something else with it, we are told by lawyers, as long as you don't copy the database itself, right? So that makes your job a little more interesting, right? If the data is free, and we'll talk about this more, it's not a problem. But if you're actually trying to control the data and make money off it somehow, then you have to really understand what the protections the law gives you and what other options you have. So there are 3 ways to control data from a legal perspective. Licenses, which is what we do now for publications, and contracts, which is the other way we handle intellectual property in our kind of scholarly communication world, and then waivers, which I'm going to go through each of these really quickly, so it should be clear that they are just kind of a continuum here. So as I said a moment ago, copyright is a bundle of rights that you're all familiar with, and it's automatic and it's limited in scope and duration. Licenses, so copyright license, relies on the copyright that you have in the content, right? So the license is saying something about that copyright. And every country has a little bit of a different take on data rights. So in some countries, like particularly in parts of Europe, there are more data rights. There's more protection than there is here in the US, which is famously kind of liberal for its approach to data rights. So licenses apply to data and databases only to the extent that they were copyrightable in the first place, okay? And only uses that implicate those copyrights trigger the license, okay? And other kinds of uses, like that don't implicate copyright, like data that was produced by the federal government and is automatically in the public domain, do not trigger the license, okay? So licenses don't protect you as much as you might think. This is a license that has been applied to lots of data. It's the next generation Creative Commons license, and it's very clear that it only pertains to the copyrightable data. It will include a whole section on data rights, because this is an international license and that became a requirement. So the problem with licenses is it's very hard to figure out what of the data is copyrightable and who might have that copyright. So it's very hard to know when the license applies, and there are risks associated with that. You might misunderstand how much protection you actually have under the law. And users may over or under comply with the terms because it's so unclear. And I also mentioned a moment ago that attribution is not the same as citation. So attribution requirements are written into these licenses, and they're very, very strict, right? And the remedy, if somebody doesn't comply, is that you can sue them. You know, that's not really what we want to be doing to researchers who fail to provide the right kind of attribution. So I could get some data, comply with the terms of the license by providing attribution in a way that doesn't get you anything like what you expected, but is legally fine. right? So I think we should just throw out this idea that attribution is the right strategy and figure out how to make citation stick in this environment. Contracts, turning to contracts for a minute. This is what most data archives are doing. Okay? If you look at all the data archives that are out there now, they're slapping a contract on there, which they call a data use agreement, usually, or a data license. So I've just pulled 3 out, but there are literally hundreds of these. Contracts don't rely on copyright. Okay? They're a contract between you and your user. So they usually take the form of a click-through license. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. And they specify exactly what the receiver of the stuff has to do in order to be compliant with that contract. They have huge downsides. Nobody reads them. So nobody really knows what's in them. They're just clicking through and saying, yeah, whatever. So, so they're not really typically going to comply with the terms because they didn't bother to read them. And a lot of times contracts have much broader reach than the law would ever have given them. So they can take away a lot of rights that you might think you have if you accept one of these licenses. So a lot of people are just avoiding getting data because they don't understand what they're legally obligated to do. And in other cases, they get the data and say, well, you know, they can sue me if I screw up. So it's not an ideal situation. And this is an interesting little nuance. They only apply to the person who clicked through. So if I click through a data archive license and get some data and then give it to my friend, that person is not obliged by the or is not, you know, under any obligation to conform to the contract because they got it from me. They didn't click through. So it's very easy to lose control of data if you rely on contracts. You could go and sue the person who did click through the license. But again, this isn't really how we want to be behaving. And then there's privacy and confidentiality. And Paula said that I would talk a lot about this, but I'm really not going to because it's a huge area, right? Very, very controversial. There are laws that are extremely strict, like HIPAA for health and human privacy. And then there are procedures that we all follow, like IRB reviews, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. These are not addressed at all by the copyright or data rights laws. They're in addition to that. And there are, as I think it was Ian said, there are lots of conflicting views coming up about the tensions between the need better research, right? So where this is coming up a lot is with consent agreements. If I have my genome sequenced by, what is that company called? 123 or, anyway, one of the personal genome companies, I view that as my data to do what I want with. But these HIPAA laws, which are meant to protect me, can often get in the way of me doing anything interesting with my own data. So the health and human privacy community is developing something called a portable consent agreement that I can sign and then, you know, send along with my data into the cloud so that anybody who finds that data knows that it's okay for them to use the data. And this is just driving the policy people in DC insane, you know, because they're trying to protect us and we're trying to say, no, stop that, you know. So there are situations like I talked about earlier where it's deadly serious that this data should be protected, and other situations where maybe not so much, but it should be up to the person who the data is about, really. So that's where we are with that, but the laws are way, way behind where people want to be with this. And then just final point is that what you typically see in the real world is something called a license agreement. And I want you to understand that the reason they're so confusing is that they're mixing a bunch of different things together. They're mixing copyright licenses with contracts, right? So if you look at some of these, this is one from the Linguistic Data Consortium. It's a very, very old data archive based at UPenn. And if you read this, which I know you can't because the type is tiny, it's very confusing, very, very confusing. And it's because they're asserting copyright over the data collection, but they're adding in a bunch of contractual terms there. And it took me about 2 hours just to figure out which part of this might even apply to me. If you read this text just for a second, you'll see what I'm talking about. Just read the first 2 sentences. Right? So you have to sort of know, I'm sorry, you in the back who can't read this, but it's sort of an if-then workflow thing, And believe me, people get this data all the time and they have no idea what they're really supposed to be doing. And furthermore, parts of it are relying on the law, which changes from country to country, and parts of it are contracts. So this is really, really not the best solution. I won't go through a lot of these. I have some other examples, but we're running short on time. So the third option you have, which those of us who work in this area really like, because it takes away a lot of the pain I've just talked about, are waivers, where you have absolute legal certainty because you've given up. Right? So a waiver is saying, whatever rights I had in this data, I give them up. You can have them. So this is what Creative Commons Zero waiver is, and it's a wonderful example. I'll show you in a second. It means you've lost control. Right? If you assign a waiver to the data, you have no rights. But you can do whatever you want with the data, as well as the rest of the world. And it really forces you back on scholarly norms to get what you need, whether that's money or credit or whatever it is. You're going to have to rely on the social contract here, not the law. CC0 is probably the most popular of these waivers, and it has 3 levels. So there's the waiver that I just described, where you're just saying, OK, take it. It's yours. I don't care. And then there's the fallback license. There are actually countries where you're not allowed to give away your rights. They just won't let you do it. So there's language in this waiver that says, and in those cases, I'm giving up these additional rights. It has to be more explicit. And the non-assertion pledge. Even if I messed up and failed to cover some law in your country, I promise I won't sue you. Right? So this is the ultimate in kind of giving up control, which is a very liberating thing, if you're trying to figure all this stuff out. So I just threw up a few examples. This is Figshare. They use CC0. I think you saw Dryad in Jerry's example, and they use CC0. So it's catching on in data because they've decided that the pain involved in trying to lock it up is not worth it. And then, of course, just a footnote on the rest of it. So you've got the data, but as you've figured out by now, the data itself is not enough, right? You need software. You need metadata. You need all kinds of stuff that comes with the data in order to do anything with it. And all of that has IP associated with it as well. So I could hand you my data and say, here, have fun, but you can't have the software that you need to open it. That is protected, and you have to pay $500 for it. So there are lots of little things to keep in mind if you're getting into the data business. We're hoping, of course, that on the research university side, we'd love to see open data, open source software, and open metadata so that none of it is controlled. But if you are getting into this game, you kind of have to look at all of those pieces and remember that governance extends to the whole umbrella. So just to summarize, licenses are legal. They work. But there is uncertainty about how much they apply to in the data realm, and they're not consistent with what scholars want to do. Contracts are very burdensome, very complicated. You need lots of lawyers to write them and interpret them. And they can often include requirements that go well beyond what the law would protect you, how well the law would protect you normally. And then waivers avoid all of those problems, but mean that you have lost any control at all over what happens to the data. So in my view, the most important thing is what I said at the beginning. We need interoperability and frictionless integration at web scale. Waivers are the easiest way to make that happen. And we can figure out how to use things like DataCite and the other tools that Jerry talked about to bring those social norms into play. And researchers are typically good people. They're not trying to make fortunes off intellectual property in this area. They're just trying to do research. So we shouldn't be getting in their way unnecessarily. Finally, this is the organization that's really taking up this cause of data governance, the Research Data Alliance. It's new. Their inaugural meeting was in Europe a few months ago. The next one will be in September in DC. So if you have any interest in being in the data business, this is the organization. It's kind of like the IETF for data. And so I would encourage you to get involved with this, maybe go to the meeting in September and just start to see what the community is developing in terms of standards and norms in this area. Thank you for your attention.